Thì đấy là những bài học mà tôi muốn chia sẻ. Vì thời gian có hạn, tôi xin kết thúc tại đây. Xin rất cảm ơn sự chú ý của các anh các chị.
Vâng, xin được cảm ơn Phó Giáo sư Tiến sĩ Vũ Minh Khương. Và để tiếp nối chương trình, xin được kính mời lên sân khấu Tiến sĩ Adam McCarty, chuyên gia kinh tế trưởng công ty tư vấn Mekong Economics. Và Tiến sĩ Adam McCarty sẽ trình bày tham luận với chủ đề xu hướng và cơ hội việc làm trong các ngành công nghiệp mới. Xin trân trọng kính mời ạ.
I have been living here for 30 years, called Việt Nam rồi, hai con trai, nhà riêng. Tôi là 5% Vietnamese rồi. I was asked today to talk about Vietnam's human resources challenge. And I realize at these events, you have a good time, you get some food, you meet your colleagues and do some networking, and you get some prizes. And the only price you have to pay is to listen to some speakers. So I will try to be not too long, and I'll try to say something interesting. My story today to you has 4 steps. Firstly, I want to explain that Vietnam has 1 decade, 10 years left for its growing workforce. And after the next 10 years, it is flat and it starts to decline. So you have 1 decade to get the most out of an increasing number of workers to become a high-income economy, which is targeted at 2045. An absolutely essential ingredient, characteristic of high-income economies is having a very high percentage of skilled workers in your workforce. This might be Vietnam's most important economic challenge in the next 10 or 20 years. I also want to talk about policy recommendations. And the first speaker also talked about new ideas and old ideas. And I want to continue about that. Because when we talk about human resources in Vietnam, we tend to come up with the same problems and solutions that we've been listening to for 20 or 30 years. And I think it's important to realize that we need to develop new ideas because there are new options out there. Markets are changing, and particularly in education. And maybe the biggest barrier to new ideas is old thinking about problems and solutions. So I want to explore that with you in the next 20 minutes. Your secretary, General To Lam, less than 2 weeks ago, gave a very interesting speech. He says, it's time for Vietnam to grow not at 4, 5, 6%, but at 10% every year. It's time for a big shake-up and some strong medicine, and to really achieve high-income economy status, and to really start catching up to China. He was very keen on Vietnam taking off, unlocking all resources, and setting specific goals and liberating labour and production capacity. So I produced a chart to look at his story there. And this is a chart here. On this side we have Vietnam's number of workers. So these are people aged between 15 and 64 years old, right? So in the last 10 years, it's grown from 64 million workers to about 68 million workers. It's grown 7%. In the next 10 years, it will continue to grow, but only 4%. And after the next 10 years, that's the end of growing workforce. It is flat and it starts to decline. And the story of Vietnam's economic success and growth rate in the past 30 years has largely been a story of more of everything, of accumulation, more investment, more workers joining the workforce, more land being brought into productive use, so that it's been a phase of growth driven by more inputs. But for Vietnam to become a rich economy, you need a new model that's driven not so much by quantity, but by quality, particularly the quality of the workforce and the skills of the workforce. Because we all know that rich, high-income economies are service economies. And service economies are all about the people working in the companies. So if Vietnam grows at 6%, it will reach this green line in 2045. That's high-income economy status, about $14,000 in real measurement terms. And at the moment, Vietnam is down here, just under $5,000. If Vietnam was to grow at 10% from now on, it would reach that green line within 10 years. So somewhere between 6 or 10%, it's going to reach this line before 2045. But that's only if that is achieved. And that's a very ambitious rate of growth. It's more than Vietnam has been doing before. And Vietnam is a very successful economy. Most economies don't grow that fast. So it's a big challenge, and it's partly driven, partly the need to move quickly is because the increase in the workforce is going to stop. So that the growth from here onwards is entirely due to productivity, to having better educated, more productive workers adding to the value added in global value chains. This is a chart from a World Bank report, recent one. It's on the website, World Bank, you can download it. It says that in Vietnam, only 5%, where's that fact? 5% of workers in high-tech manufacturing are highly skilled. And the demand for these workers is very high. Their wages have been going up in the last 7 years. And compared to the wages of university graduates in low-tech manufacturing, they're being left behind. So that as Vietnam moves to high-tech manufacturing, there's a shortage of the right skilled labours, and their wages, what you're paying them, is getting higher and higher compared to the low-tech manufacturing skilled workforce. So you do have a shortage, and some of your research from Viet Research and Navigos are also pointing to sectoral shortages of skilled workers. So there is a problem. It's pretty clear from the numbers there are not enough today of highly skilled, the right type of highly skilled workers. And if you want to achieve those ambitious goals in the next 10 or 20 years, you need a lot more of them. So, quality growth is about skilled workforce. Vietnam's growth, as I said, remains driven by capital accumulation and measures of productivity which are difficult to measure, but generally Vietnam is weak compared to other countries. Vietnam needs to move, but moving from low value added activities towards sophisticated participation in global value chains is really difficult. It's a big challenge. It's much more difficult than the challenge Vietnam has had so far. For me, Vietnam is just finishing a phase where you could say that tens of millions of Vietnamese have moved from farms to factories. That's a fairly simple model of rural-urban migration. But the next stage, from middle income to high income, is much more complicated, much more skilled workforce, much more integration into the world economy, less protectionism, more competition. Core solutions to achieving this new model. Moving from just the focus on basic education, which Vietnam does well, to creating a large number of highly skilled workers. and moving from labour-intensive final assembly to high-skill and technology-intensive, high-value-added activities. That's the transition Vietnam has to do. High-income economies are globally competitive services economies, and those economies are built on a foundation of highly skilled, productive workers. These are some recommendations from that World Bank report about how to move from basic education to a high-skilled workforce. I won't go in the details, but generally, of course, you have to invest more, you have to reform curriculum, you have to integrate better with the demands of business, right? Business should be leading curriculum reform and leading, working with the government day to day to say what they need in terms of skilled workers, and the government can then deliver. And technical and vocational education, we've been talking about this for 30 years, and there's still a lot of very poor technical and vocational education in Vietnam. There's still fights between ministries about who owns what and who's in charge of what. So this also is an area that needs some strong medicine. But I would say that this list of recommendations is correct, but we've seen them all before. They're typical recommendations. There's nothing much new about them. And that's why I say I call them usual. Government investment, measure things better, have an industry-led planning model, encourage competition everywhere. But we've been saying this for 30 years. What about some, and I think in this area and every area you think about now, just say, let's think of some unusual recommendations, some strategic ones. Vietnam needs to understand global education trends. Education is now what we economists call a traded good. So you can get it overseas if you want it. So if your universities are not good enough, then a Vietnamese student will just go overseas to get their university education, and tens and thousands of them do. That didn't happen 40 years ago. That's new. These things are new. So you need to understand the trends in education. You need to formally sit down and say, what is the role of government in education? And come up with principles and guidelines about this is the job of the private sector, this is the job of the government. And on a more practical level, attract foreign educators, individual persons like me, and organisations as aggressively as you attract factories. So you're very keen to bring foreign investor in, to set up a factory and employ Vietnamese workers. And the factory owners, Korean, Taiwanese, they make money and they export goods, right? But you don't have the same thinking about education sector. Somehow education needs to be protected, or not too much foreign competition. You only have one truly foreign university in Vietnam, RMIT, and they're having trouble getting their license renewed. So it's like education is different. Why not just encourage education organisations like you do factories to come and train Vietnamese and make money for themselves? That is a quick way to inject some energy into making a skilled workforce. Let domestic organisations close down if they fail to reform. Too many dead, boring, not very productive education institutions, particularly in vocational education. Use overseas education to jumpstart domestic reform and seriously fund completing quality online courses. online courses, that's something also that's what? The last 10 years? Like really good courses, high quality courses with certification, and you have to pay, and you have very good teachers and very good tutorials, and you get a good education. Why not just pay 100,000 Vietnamese to do these courses? Whoop, I've lost my thing. I have this old thinking problem too with young Vietnamese I meet. And they say, I've done my study and I'm looking for a job. And they're 20-something years old and their English is totally fluent. So I say, so are you looking to work only in Vietnam? And they go, oh no, I'm not going to travel and live in Australia or America or somewhere. I said, no, you can be in Vietnam and you can work in Australia on an Australian salary. And they go, oh, that's a good idea. And these are just some jobs from Australian Job Seeker. Remote data entry, working from home, $68 an hour. Data entry and bookkeeping assistant, work from home, $34 an hour. So even employment is a traded good now. You can be a digital nomad. We talk about this, but when I say digital nomad, you think of, oh, foreigners coming to Thailand or Vietnam. It can also be Vietnamese who are working for companies in America or somewhere but live in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. So the market is changing, how education is delivered is changing, and all of this you need to think of how you can use it or how it is impacting your business. This is my industry. I work in development assistance, and this is a table of advertisements for jobs in development assistance, so a few hundred jobs. And about a quarter of jobs for consulting organisations or non-government organisations are work-from-home jobs. As I said, education is a traded good now. If domestic universities are not good enough, students go overseas, paying the full fee. I put KPI here. You all know what KPI is, right? A KPI of the Vietnamese university system is having fewer Vietnamese students go overseas for their education. The role of the state. The private sector needs to fill the gaps. There should be more encouragement of private universities, Vietnamese and foreign. And the private sector covers curriculum weaknesses. There are some curricula that just change all the time, and the bureaucratic systems cannot keep up with the changing curriculum of, say, in architecture or coding. You need the private sector to just be free to just grab the most recent technologies and teach people. Or the private sector just does whatever can make lots of money, like English language training. Government should be about quality control and the enforcement of that quality. So the government says, this is what a Vietnamese electrician needs to learn and be able to do. And that's a complicated thing to do, actually. And then it needs to certify the institutions that are reaching that standard, and then it needs to go and just make sure they're not cheating. So that is a very important job for government, but government doesn't need to do the teaching. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Adam McCarty. Yes, và xin chân thành cảm ơn tiến sĩ Adam McCarty về bài tham luận của ông. Và thưa quý vị, khi đề cập tới kiến tạo giá trị cho xã hội, chúng ta không thể không nhắc tới những nỗ lực xanh hóa quy trình kinh doanh và quản trị của các doanh nghiệp. Chúng ta sẽ cùng tìm hiểu về xu thế này cũng như cách để doanh nghiệp thích nghi với nó thông qua